Okay, welcome back to the podcast. This is episode number 150 with my guest, Bobby Previte. Bobby is a drum set player and a composer and improviser who wrote a piece for solo percussion called Terminals, a 5-movement piece with basically percussion, quartet accompaniment with improvising soloist. I don't really know how to describe Bobby other than he's somebody you probably want to have in your life. He's a great person, and he has more energy and passion for the things he works on than most anybody else I've ever come across. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I certainly did, and I love Bobby. So without further ado, Bobby Previte. Take care. Talk to you soon. Bye. Well, hey, Bobby Previte, before I get too far along here. Okay, Bobby, I am grateful for you doing this with me, and I've known you now for I don't know how long through So Percussion. I feel like I want to say at least 10 years. Would that be fair to say?
I think, yeah, it's getting on to that, Josh. Yeah, I think 10 years could be. I think it was we did the Terminals in 2013, maybe 11.
Okay, but then that's when we started it, or was that when we premiered it?
No, that's when we premiered it. So we knew each other before then, certainly, because we were rehearsing. Yeah, I think 10 years is good.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting to me, like, you know, what I know about you. My introduction to you, if I didn't know anything else about you, would be like, oh, this is Bobby. He went to the University of Buffalo, studied with Jan Williams. He's a percussion nerd like me, and he does weird percussion ensemble stuff. But then what I learned about you, which was like I think most of your life, is like you hang out with really badass like improvisers, and you come from that world too. And like people like that's how I met John Medeski. That's how I got to play with Jen Shu and other folks who I just had never ever even imagined existed. and just hearing you talk about music, hearing about the way you play music, and just you have. I'm just saying a lot of things, so I don't have a question. I'm just telling you what I've learned from you, and you have this unstoppable fire hose type of energy when it comes to getting music together in rehearsal and then on stage. Like you're never like halfway on, and I've always respected that about you. And I'm just kind of curious. I wanted to start with you, maybe like as like baby Bobby. And figure out how in the hell did you get to that? So all of that said, I don't have a question maybe in there, but I'm just kind of curious, like what the tree that is now Bobby Previte at however old you are. I'm going to say 32. What did the seed look like? Well,
wow, you know, how far back should I go? I mean, I was brought up in a lower middle class. A Catholic Italian family in a very conservative town, Niagara Falls, New York. Very strange town, I might add. There's a really great book, I think, Niagara Falls. It's called something like Truth, Power, and Lies. Niagara Falls is was a bizarre place to grow up because you have the falls, which is, you know, the eighth wonder of the world, and which is very, very cosmopolitan, right? I mean, everyone knows about the falls, right? But no one knows about the town of Niagara Falls. But I've traveled all over the world, as you do, as a musician, and finally people say, well, where are you from, if it ever comes up? And I say Niagara Falls, and everyone knows the chute de Niagara. Yeah, sure, everyone knows what Niagara Falls is, but no one knows anything about it, right? So the town itself in Niagara Falls was very, very conservative Italian town. And in fact, it was so Italian that Niagara Falls didn't have an Italian mayor for hundreds of years, until kind of recently, because they didn't need one. You see, so they always put the Irish guys were the mayors, but the Italians were, right. They ran the town. So you had this very world. I used to. So as a kid, it was very provincial and, Italian and conservative. But then I would go down to the falls and I would have my favorite spots. I'd had this one spot I loved to watch where the water would eddy a certain way. And, but there would be people there in turbans and, it was just all people from all over the world. Right. Mm-hmm. But they were only there, only within the 3-block radius of the falls, mm-hmm. As soon as you got past that, it was completely, back to provincial USA. So it was I think it was very schizophrenic, right? Mm-hmm. And then the same thing with my musical upbringing, because I came from a very unmusical family. I mean, we didn't even have a record player. My parents never listened to music. My mother did like to dance.
What did they do for a living?
My father worked in a factory. He was a foreman in a factory, and my mother, of course, never worked. My father wouldn't allow her to work, so she was the house. And we lived in a very small house. Our house was so small that my brother had to sleep on a sofa bed in the living room. I slept in a room with my sister until it just got untenable, right? She got too old, mm-hmm. To be sleeping with her younger brother mm-hmm. in the same room, and so I had to sort of sleep in the basement. We had a very small house, and so my father, he worked shift work, and he would go to work all day, and and I would. And I would hang around in Niagara Falls. And so, Niagara Falls, it had the East Coast mob was headquartered in Niagara Falls. It was close to Niagara Falls. There was all this pollution, of course, in Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls had and has more toxic dumps per capita or per square foot than any place in the United States, maybe any place on Earth.
Wow.
So you remember the anthrax whole scare, right?
Right.
Well,
right.
Remember Tom Brokaw, the anchor for
mm-hmm.
NBC. Remember when he got an anthrax letter, and the dudes had to come in and, with the hazmat suits and pulverize desk because it was opened on his desk. So they came in and pulverized his desk. Well, that pulverized desk is buried in Niagara Falls. So just a little.
Well, the sort of commonality I share with you is growing up in the Midwest in the area of the Great Lakes. Like that's where a lot of, just historically speaking, the reason that pollution exists is because when industry started, surrounding those lakes, having bodies of water where your shipping could drop stuff off, that was the main reason that stuff existed. And now it's at the time, maybe now that's not the way those lakes are used, but that's why, but that's also partially probably why Buffalo became a cultural hub in addition to just being a sort of worldly, like you said, the eighth wonder. Buffalo also was a port, where people dropped stuff off, and and that's also why there's people with turbans and other things there. You get people from all over the world coming.
15 miles on the Erie Canal,
right.
The Erie Canal connected Buffalo, and that was all destroyed by air travel. Mm-hmm. Buffalo was the queen city of the lakes, and Charlie Parker would come through, and Dizzy Gillespie would come through, and all these musicians would come through. It was an important city. But they would dump. There were toxic dumps. They would just dump right into the fall. They were right on the falls. They were right next to the falls were all the factories. And we used to say there was tons of chemical plants also in Niagara Falls. And there were some days where I would go out and my nose would be burning. And I was a kid. I didn't know what it was. I would just say, oh, well, this is one of those days that your nose burns. I don't know why, but yeah. And it's but it was literally. Yeah. So then, finally, all that got cleaned up. But Niagara Falls remained a very bizarre town. And, and so my family, being a musical family, we watched television. And we went to church. So all the music that I heard was like either sacred Catholic liturgical music or television music, right? So that was the two musics that I grew up with. I never heard any classical music. I never heard any jazz. I heard like pop music on the radio, television theme songs, and organ music. And so somehow these things all jumbled together. And, that's kind of, where my sort of first musical thing happened. And then I got older and,
well, I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't want to interrupt you, but like it's interesting. I don't think I knew the thing about like just the types of music you grew up around. And then the minute you said church, I immediately, I don't know whether this is accurate. So this could just be me making some weird free association. So tell me if this is bullshit, but like I immediately thought of the movement from Terminals with Xena.
Yeah. With Xena.
Like my part is just like it just feels to me like that whole piece is just like a huge organ. It's like the organ in Mahler 2 or whatever, it's just, but except that's all it is, and then Xena's on top of it improvising.
I'm sure that's coming.
Well, I'm curious for you as a kid though, like where was like you have all that stuff, but where was the first time where you started to participate in a musical thing?
Oh, that's a good story, Josh.
I like good stories, Bobby.
Okay, so I was 13 years old, and I had been I was the kid in the neighborhood who made up all the games. I would make up these games like we're going to do this, and this is because back then you sort of did make up things because there were less things. So I would always like we're going to do the game goes like this, and I would always be frustrated because I would make up these games that the object wasn't to win the game; it was to kind of have. I couldn't express this as a kid, but the idea was to make it artful. And I would try to explain that to my mates, and they just didn't understand. They kept trying to win. I was going, no, it's not about winning. You have to look. It has to look beautiful, and So you can see I was kind of a bit of a weirdo. So at 13, my cousin, who got everything usually, and I got nothing, but that's another story, got a drum set. Right? And I was like, oh my God. So I went over there and I would play his drum set. I would be allowed to play his drum set. Okay. My father, before he became a factory worker, went to barber school and he hated it. He went all the way through barber school. 15 minutes after he graduated, he quit. But of course, Italian family, he would cut all the hair, right? Because that's what Italian families do, right? Right? So,
I don't think that's a fair thing to assume people know. I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is what my Italian family did. But just that if you had a skill in an Italian family, you did that skill. My Uncle John made the wine, and he came with the wine every week with the 2 bottles of wine for our whole family for the week, right? He'd come with the big jugs of wine, but it was terrible. So my father would take the wine and say, thank you, Uncle John. And then he would pour the wine down the drain. And in the bottles, he would pour like Gallo, which was also terrible. But imagine how terrible.
Not as terrible.
Not as terrible. And so Uncle John never knew. But so if you had a skill, you applied that skill to the rest of the family. So my father had the skill of cutting hair. So naturally, people were going to pay to have their hair cut. My father would cut their hair. So my father's brother and his son was my age, and he got a drum set. And so the deal was when I went over there, when he went over there to cut my cousin Russell's hair, I could play the drums. Only during the time that he got his hair cut, which was 15 minutes. So I got to play the drums 15 minutes a month. And it was the most amazing 15 minutes. I would look forward to this 15 minutes for the entire month. I was like, okay, here it comes. And I would practice on my pad, everything I wanted to work out. And then I would get there and they would say, okay, Bobby, go. And I would just play the drums for 15 minutes and that was it. And then I have to stop. And imagine this, now I have workshops.
There's nobody I could imagine more clearly than you doing this, Bobby.
And, so now sometimes I have workshops and I look at my students and, if I have one that's not motivated or something, I look at them like, really? I have to motivate you? No, 'cause I was so highly motivated.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I wanted a drum set. And, weirdly, I started on guitar. I tried to play guitar. I didn't play guitar very well, but I always remember being able to play drums, to play the drums. I'm sure that I couldn't really play very well, but I never remembered that moment, Josh.
Mm-hmm.
I always remember that I sat down and the drums made perfect sense to me. The cymbals and the tom-toms and all, because the drum set, let's face it, is a weirdo amalgamation. Is it an instrument or is it 10 instruments? No one really knows. It's only an instrument because for 100 years, people have been playing it as an instrument. And all the great drummers have made the drum set one instrument. But really, it's an amalgamation of many instruments. It's,
right.
cymbals from Turkey and snare drum, which is kind of military, and tom-toms from Africa. So it's all
and it's different from a clarinet in the sense that, like, yes, both are instruments, but like the clarinet, the low E flat on a clarinet or low C or whatever it is, like, doesn't serve only one function traditionally. Like, it's a note like every other. The kick drum or the hi-hat, like, those were, like, what you're doing is taking an instrument, right, that served one purpose whenever you had a marching band or a second line band or something, and then you're putting it with one person to try to do all of those roles. And I think what's interesting is, I don't, maybe this is a podcast for another time, but, like, I would love to just pick your brain on the lineage of drummers that changed the roles of each of those instruments within the drum set and how that sort of pushed music history forward. Like,
absolutely. So, because it's a made up instrument, an E flat on a clarinet down here and up there. It's kind of homogenous, right? It's the same sort of thing. But a drum set is it's a crazy instrument, which is why I contend that the drum set is the most melodic instrument on earth. I really believe that. I believe that the drum set, even though it doesn't have an A or a B or a C, really, it's endlessly melodic. I feel like I can make endless melodies on the drum set forever because of that fact, because it's not limited to actual equal tempered notes.
Well, and it's also an instrument, though, that, like, I mean, every instrument has this, but I've heard you also you said, and I'm sort of paraphrasing what I remember you saying about, like, cymbals are the last bastion of the charlatan or something like that, because you have this last refuge. Yeah, well, and I mean that, like, it's a fine line, right? There are people like Tony Williams who can play a hi-hat or a ride cymbal for 17 minutes straight, and it never loses interest, and it never loses its job, right? But then there are some people who play the ride cymbal to cover up everything else they're doing, like, and
or the famous crash,
right? Yeah.
What should I do? Okay.
Yeah, it's just like a crossfade on a video, When you always use.
Right. You crash a cymbal, it takes a while to, so then you can think, oh, now what?
Yeah. Well, anyway, so sorry, we got sidetracked. But so you're playing drum set 15 minutes a month.
So I'm playing drums at 15 minutes a month, and I'm taken with the drum set. I can barely play because I'm hyperventilating. I think it's so beautiful. The sounds, the way they go together, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life. And I decided, of course, I want a drum set too, right? Of course, my father wasn't going to buy me a drum set. He didn't want to have to listen to it. Second off, he didn't want to spend the money.
You have a small house, Bobby. Let's give your dad some slack here a little bit.
We have a really small house. So I decide
just having you by yourself in that small house is enough chaos for your poor father.
Well, we haven't even gotten to my brother. He was worse. So I decided to make my own drum set. I said, okay, so I get it. Nobody's going to give me a drum set. Nobody's going to do this for me. So I'm going to go. I marched down to the paper, the Niagara Falls Gazette. I got a job as a paper boy. I saved $10 a week, put it under my socks, and never told anybody. and waited until I had enough money to buy a drum set. But in the meantime, I made a drum set out of garbage cans, and my cymbals were 2 aluminum pie plates that I nailed to plungers for stands. My stands were plungers, and I nailed my mother's aluminum pie plates. Oh my God, I'd put a nail through them. She was really pissed. And when I would ding, and they sounded so cool. And I had my bass drum my snare drum was just a box of junk, because I couldn't make a snare drum. So I took a thin box and I put a bunch of junk in it, and then it rattled. And that was my snare drum. And I had, a kind of rubber baskets were my toms. That was easy. My bass drum was a heavy garbage can turned on its side, but my bass drum pedal was my greatest creation. I made a bass drum pedal out of linoleum and a coat hanger and a rubber ball. I put these 2 pieces of linoleum together, and I took the coat hanger and wound it around a baseball bat and made it into a spring, and then I put it between right between the linoleum, and then I stuck one part up and I put a ball on it, and that was my pedal. And it worked perfectly. And I played those drums for 1 year in my basement. 1 year, until I saved enough money to buy this drum set right here. That drum set is my paper route drum set from 1965, a Rogers Holiday model, and they are just killer, right?
I was going to say this. You're, having watched you tune your drum set enough. It's not like I've been touring with you extensively for all 10 years that I've known you, but sitting behind you and just sort of being a fly on the wall while you make your sounds do what you want them to do on the drum set, and rental kits that you backline or whatever where we go. Like knowing your very first. I mean, that was the sound that imprinted on your brain, whether you knew it or not. And so when you got that nice new Rogers kit, I'm sure there was a tiny part of you that was like, you made that Rogers kit like that. Your sound is your baby sound still. Like it's still there. You had a bass drum, like you had a nice big round trash can that probably was a little more resonant than other trash cans, like.
Exactly. That's very accepted. That's right. Because it was do, 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 do,
yeah,
like
you don't
that.
play you don't play a kick like a short rock kick. It's a very resonant sound.
Yeah, no, I like them to speak. And, I didn't know that Rogers drums were great drums. I bought them because that's what I could afford. I went to the store, and there they were, and they looked nice. And I thought, okay, I'm going to get these drums. I was in a band and everything. And, I started the band with my homemade drums. But then we got a gig, and they fired me out of my own band, from my own band. Actually, that was the day I decided to get the paper route.
Well, here's the thing that's I'm very curious. Like I think I get your argument about the cymbals being the last refuge, but I'm very curious if your very first like experience in the world was like a really nice Bosphorus cymbal or a really lovely Zildjian cymbal, that your whole worldview would be completely different. Like the fact that your first cymbals were pie plates, not super resonant, like probably influenced the fact like you heard somebody else using a ride cymbal and there's like little jealousy. You're like, no, I'm gonna get that.
Yeah, no, but I do love. Of course, I do love the cymbals, and my cymbals are. I have very big and heavy cymbals.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been a proponent of big cymbals. It's just kind of how I feel like I can get a lot of different sonorities and sounds and things out of a bigger cymbal. I think the trend now is for quicker sounding, bright cymbals. I just hate that sound. That sound. I want something that I can work with. Like I can, like everything else, Josh. I mean, these days all I'm interested in is touch and feel and dynamics. That's I'm not interested in content. I'm not interested in what you play or what to play. I'm only interested in how you play it.
Right. Right.
So I'm really interested in touch and feel and emotion and intent. Those are the things that are important to me. And well,
I was just going to say, I'm curious now. I mean, I'm as you're talking, I'm having so many questions, and we could just sit here and talk all day. But I'm curious for you and knowing where you ended up in terms of, going to University of Buffalo as a student and meeting someone like Jan Williams, and then leaving the university setting and pretty much like I remember you like your touring stories are insane to me. Like you kind of like you were in the university setting and then you did the sort of like you had your Rumspringa and you're like no, I'm gonna go out and do the like I'm gonna go grind it out. And I'm just kind of curious a little bit, like you can talk about however much of what you want to, but I'm curious, like you get this drum set, like what was the path to take you to Jan Williams? And then after Jan Williams, how did you get stuck behind the Iron Curtain in Russia during the fall of the Soviet Union? Like, to me, those are big mile markers, and I want you to walk me through that.
Okay. Well, yeah, I got my drum set. The band rehired me, and I started on my arc of playing the drums, playing in bands. So, and I never had a drum lesson. Mm-hmm. I learned everything from records and from playing, learned by doing. That was me. So I never had a drum teacher, and I just played, listened some more. And then my dad died when I was 17. And that, although I loved my dad, but the restraints on me were loosened, right? So I went to school and I went to the University of Buffalo, not only because I could only afford it. It was close by, right? I couldn't go anywhere else. So little did I know that Jan Williams and John Cage, I didn't even know who these people were there. I went to become a dentist,
No shit. I didn't know that.
Yeah. My father wanted me to be a dentist. So I went to be a dentist. And even though he had died, his voice was still in my ear. I couldn't be a musician. I had to be, something professional, because I was one of the first people in my entire extended family to go to college. In fact, my cousin recently gave me a genealogy from 1860 of my entire family, including over 500, 600 people. And I went through this, and not one of them is an artist. Only me.
What's that whole I crawled so you could walk, I walked so you could march, I marched so you could run, like all of that thing. And then eventually, like if you have kids, if you have, I mean, I don't know if you do or not, but and I don't know if you do or not, but there's like eventually it comes back around and the artist has a child who's just like, I'm going to farm. And it starts all over the starts all over. I have a daughter.
I have a daughter, and when she was 13, seeing my struggle, she just announced to me, apropos of nothing, one day. We walked out of the elevator, and she said, Daddy, I want to be an artist too, but I want to be a different kind of artist. Translation: I'd like to make some money.
I want to be the type of artist that grows their own food and can eat. And sleep exactly. And is home and in bed by 9 p.m. That would be lovely.
I respect what you're doing, but I don't want to do it. So, so anyway, I went to the University of Buffalo to become a dentist, and I would, but I found myself drifting into the music department and listening to these concerts, and I would start hearing these wild stuff, Max Neuhaus and Cage, and because they were all there. Legere and Hiller was there. Morton Feldman was there running the department. Lucas Foss was there. And then they used to do these concerts called Evenings for New Music, where they'd do it in the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, and they would be packed. And I just thought, this is the most bizarre music. I didn't even get it, right? And at the same time, friends of mine who were turning me on to Monk and Mingus and Miles. And so these things were just colliding in this like R&B drummer kid's head, right? All this stuff. And then, I just realized I don't think I can be a dentist, I really think I've got to try to be a musician. So I called up the music department and said I would like to audition as a percussionist. Okay, now
I just want to say real quick, Bobby, that I think there's a lot of people who I think there's a lot of people who should thank their lucky stars that you didn't become a dentist. It is really hard for me to imagine the frenetic energy that you have just in the way that you just are being inside someone's mouth with a sharp tool. Just is like, man, you really got bumped down the right path, Bobby. I just wanted to sort of highlight that for people. Your life would be a lot different right now.
I've never thought of it quite like that, but you're probably right.
Your malpractice insurance would be through the roof. It'd be crazy.
Yeah. So I did my audition with Jan, and for some reason he took it. And so I was in the percussion department, and I was in the percussion ensemble. Now I had started so late. I was just kind of a miserable percussionist. I just wasn't very good percussionist, really. I mean, you guys. That's when I got a chance to work with you and the rest of the guys, and I would just be, I just would have so much. I was just astonished by the skill level. It just was kind of like for me, it's like just through the roof. I could never do that. It's like if we were both in the Olympics, right, Bobby? We're just in different events, and you're Usain Bolt, and you're regularly hanging out with John Medeski, and like I said earlier, people who are legit surgeons in their field, and then I'm a professional speed walker, Bobby. I'm really good at speed walking. But you're Usain Bolt, for fuck's sake. We can hang out. It's okay. We're not better. It's just we're different. It's different sports, Yeah. But I just all to say, much respect, because I know what that takes. Because I went through that, and I went through that program, and watching you and Eric and Jason and Adam, it was just sort of wow, these guys. Also, I really, just as a side note, I really love the way you guys worked together. And I often tell people would ask me about, well, what was it like to work with So? And, besides those guys are a drag or whatever, besides all that, what I really took away the most was I love the way you have a rotating and floating, I won't say leader, but the way you go through music is it's so egoless and so wonderful. And so, I would watch you when you were rehearsing the percussion parts and terminals going, I can't do that there. I've got it there. I've got it for these kind of bars. Okay. And now I have it. And now I have it. And the way, because early on, if you don't remember, but I said, should we get Jan to conduct it? And Jason said, Bobby, we don't really work with a conductor. And I couldn't imagine how you were going to do this piece without a conductor, right? But you did. And I watched how you did it. So much respect.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think you'll agree with this, that oftentimes I struggle when people are when people say things we need to everything needs to be egalitarian and equal. Everything, there's no hierarchies ever in life. We need to break it all down. And I understand the arguments in a lot of the parts of society people are talking about. I get it, and I support those arguments. But within music, I hear that argument sometimes too, let's just we're going to feel it out. We're all going to make the decisions together. Have you ever looked at nature? Look at a flock of geese, right? They're flying in the most efficient way possible to go the farthest way they can with the least amount of energy. There's not one bird always in front. All the rest of them are drafting. That happens in the Tour de France too. There's a reason Lance Armstrong's not the one. Well, Lance is maybe a bad example, but there's a reason the yellow jersey guy is not in front all the time, because it takes a lot of energy. You're the tip of the spear splitting the air, And I think it's not maybe a conscious decision on our end. That's not what we thought early on. It's let's be like a flock of geese, but life is just way easier that way. You get way farther with way less work, and I see you work that way with John Medeski. When you guys talk about stuff, maybe you don't say it in the same words, but you guys aren't just sort of hey, you do whatever you want to do, and I'll do whatever I want to do, and then we'll just sort of hope it works. See ya.
Right. And as an improviser, there's a very fine line. You sort of know This way, people who write for it's very difficult to write for improvisation. Actually, people don't think it is. People just say, "Oh, I'm going to write this," and then just do what you want. But that rarely actually works. You really have to know how to write for improvisation. So obviously, the first thing is you have to know the person you're writing for. I know John. I know what he does. I know what alleys and what roads to send him down where he will be challenged, but also find something that he could find something, and where the road won't be a dead end for him, or the road will be too easy, for him. There's always this fine line, and when to have improvisation and when to not have improvisation. So it's kind of the same thing. So we in that world, we know each other. We know each other so well, and we know how to do it, as you guys know how to put a piece of music together. So, I mean,
you've just had that conversation a million times. I mean, that's the thing when you talk about your at bats as an artist, like playing in tiny little clubs and doing that not twice and then being like, okay, cool, I think I kind of know how that goes now. Like, no, you've done it thousands of times, and like you've just had that conversation so much that you can use slang now with John Medeski. I keep saying John Medeski. You play with a million other people, but like for me, that's where I saw that conversation happen the quickest with you. Like that's when I was in the room, and it's like, oh wow, they're using slang. I kind of can get the gist of what they're saying because I've had a similar conversation in a different language with my friends. But you're having the conversation. That's my point.
Right. And it's understood. And, if you write one note too many, you can destroy the entire section.
Right.
If you write one note too many in a section that's supposed to also be improvised, or you can destroy the whole thing. It's really delicate balance. And that's part of the discussion. Hey, John, what do you think about this? What do you want to do there? Right. Like, well, you play this line and then this kind of thing. Right. And we all understand. And yes, it's got a lot to do with just doing it.
How much of your time, I'm curious if you could, and again, I'm asking the question, I don't know if this is true. How much of your time playing chamber music with Jan Williams at the University of Buffalo affected the way you played chamber music in a bar with, a pickup group or your friends that that playing non sort of John Cage style contemporary percussion stuff? Did you sort of actively carry any of that over into your touring life after school?
That's an interesting question that no one ever asks me. No one. It's incredible that you asked that question because there is an answer, and I think what happened to me was I came from being a drummer who when you're a drummer you're playing a groove and you're playing time, right? To becoming a musician that through the drum set is looking for something on top of the time or with the time. I'm looking for melody and I'm looking for moments. I think all those the chamber music that I played with Jan and being in the percussion ensemble were these. I came upon these incredible moments in these pieces. These pieces would go along, and all of a sudden there'd be this two bars that I would just love. Right? You just two bars that just go like, oh my God, this is worth the price of admission right here. Just these two bars.
Do you know the piece Raintree?
No.
It's a Japanese composer, Toru Takamitsu, and it's a
sure.
marimba, two marimbas, one vibraphone, and there's crotales. It's gorgeous. Look it up, you'll love it. It's it's kind of like Japanese minimal or impressionism, I would say. Like it's gorgeous, and the whole piece is awesome. And it's in this weird F sharp sort of minor thing. F sharps and A's come back a million times, and it's this weird harmonically ambiguous world. Gorgeous. The last chord is a D flat major chord that kind of just appears out of nowhere and makes total sense. And it's like, you wait that whole time, and the most unexpected thing comes, and you're like, oh, I was sold before, but now, that's so crazy.
It's all because it was all set up, all E flat are not created equally. Some are banal and some are sublime, right? It just depends on what came before and what the intent was and what comes after or doesn't come after and what instrument play, right? And he set that up so beautifully. And So I sort of carried that's what I carried over from my years with Jan, and I wanted to play the drums in a different way, but I could play time. See? So it's very interesting because I can always tell. I will say this. After having said I was a miserable percussionist, I can usually tell when there's a percussionist who's playing a kit, right? Because there's a certain way percussionists play a drum set,
right?
And
I would probably put myself in that category, just to be quite honest. I mean, I know enough to be dangerous. Like, I know enough to convince a lot of people that I know what I'm doing, but I don't know enough to convince you. Like, but we're friends, and you would never be mean to me, and I make up for it. Like, I play steel drums, I can make up for it in other ways. But I'm saying that, like, what you're saying is true. Like, it's just an objective truth, because you can you hear the sound. The sound is different. It's maybe not necessarily bad, like an objectively bad thing, and it could be used in interesting ways, but it's a sound when you hear someone who doesn't grow up on that sound playing it,
It's something to do with the integration of all the disparate elements we were talking about before.
Right.
There's something about, and I'm a drummer that uses percussionistic expressions in their drumming, right? But it's all about melding it into sort of one, so it's all in one zone, kind of. And this is what I hear a lot of times if I'm hearing a percussionist play drums. It's interesting. It's very hard to describe, but I hear it. It's very hard to describe, but I hear the elements. It's almost like I hear the elements too much, and I don't hear the integration of the elements enough.
I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier. Like, we were talking about the very beginning about the drum set being this thing that isn't like on a clarinet where a low E flat and a high E flat are homogenous. Like, you can't treat the drum set like a keyboard, like low, right, medium, high, medium, low. Like, no. It's boom, crack, pss, crack, boom. Like, those are three wildly different characters.
Yes. Somehow you have to make those sound almost like a keyboard.
Right. Well, you have to balance. You have to mix it on the fly.
You have to yes. And this is what I've been into lately on the drum set: internal dynamics. This is another thing: the internal dynamics of the drum set, not the general dynamics of the whole drum set, but what happens when you're constantly adjusting the internal dynamics of the drum set. What happens when you're constantly pulling back the ride cymbal and your left hand is going back for the, so all the balance, so the drum set becomes this wavy thing that's moving around through time and through space. But the dynamics of changing of the dynamics slightly on the drum set is a world unto itself. It opens up a completely different way of thinking about the sound. How much of, again, I'm piecing together things here that make sense to me, but I'm curious if they do to you. Like,
I remember you telling a story about how you would you used to, I don't know if it's mastering or mixing or something, where you like, okay, we're going to do a mix, and you do the automation in real time. Like, you have one hand on this fader and you're doing these things, and it's like you get through the whole thing, and if you mess up one ride, you got to go back and do it again, and then that's slightly unique. But it's kind of like, did you tell me that story, or am I thinking of someone else? You're close. I told you a story about mixing something like that. It's a Joe Furla story. Yes. Yeah, but it's also, like it reminds me of the way you play drum set. Like, you're constantly like you have your finger on all of the faders, and you're constant like a puppet trying to sort of mix it in real time. Right, because it does need to be mixed in real time, because otherwise it's flat. It has no dimensionality, right? It doesn't have the depth. It's just there in front of your face, right? Right. And so when you're moving, well, did Gorecki say at a workshop he came and he played this polychord and boom, and he said that's a form, and then he played boom the same chord exactly but quietly, and he said that's another form. That's another form. That's super interesting. It's not the same thing, quieter. It's totally different. Mm-hmm. It's another form completely. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the mindset that this is what I'm thinking, when you're varying the internal dynamics of the instrument, right?
I mean, everybody pianists do this. I listen to Jamie Saff play piano, and he's doing a run up, and it's not all the same. It's not all the same volume or touch even, or it's all. I got a chance to play with some great trumpeters like Lou Soloff and Jack Walrath, and these people. It wasn't that they could play fast or they had a lot of course they did. Lou Soloff was first call trumpet player for many years. Remember, he was in Blood, Sweat and Tears before the trumpeter in Blood, Sweat and Tears before he had a whole career as first call trumpet player. But when you played with him, every note had a different color. He'd do a run, and all the notes the colors would be changing, just very subtly, but changing. That's another level.
Yeah.
That is another level of music.
Well, I'm curious. I mean, you got that. You've always had that sound in or that approach in your head in terms of my work with you, and I'm curious with your touring. I mean, one of the things that drummers I think have to deal with more so than I keep talking about clarinets, but let's just stick with let's just piss off every clarinetist in the world right now. But a clarinetist doesn't have to backline a clarinet. Never backlines a clarinet. Like the symphony, like when the Cleveland Orchestra goes on tour, they're not like sending backline riders to the local rental company saying I need an E flat clarinet. But a drummer, maybe you'll bring your cymbals. Most drummers do, no, but
I don't.
Right. So you play what's there, and so not only do you have to rebuild your instrument from the ground up, now you have an instrument where your kick might be way drier than you're used to, and you now have to not only mix on the fly, but you have to overcompensate on an instrument that now you have to turn the gain way up on that you never had to do before. Like now you have to kick it way harder than you used to, and that.
But I don't.
Well, I know, but there's a whole you have to recalibrate, and I'm curious for you. I mean, you mentioned the thing like no special drums. Is like part of your demand on your backline rider. Can you talk a little bit about how you approach? Like you have that your ideology, right, of how you want to play sound, but then how does that graft onto when the rubber meets the road? Well,
simply, I don't force the instrument to do something it doesn't want to do. It's like, okay, in that specific instrument instance, if I get a bass drum that's particularly dry or that I don't really like the sound of, or I have to change the way I play to accommodate the instrument. I'm never going to make that bass drum do what this bass drum does. Mm-hmm. And why should it? So this is why I find it kind of interesting and exciting. Sometimes it's a drag, don't get me wrong, but interesting and exciting to get a new set of drums and cymbals every night. Because every night I'm presented with a new palette, and I have to figure out how to integrate that into what the music I'm doing at the moment, but it's going to be different. So the way I compensate, and I don't really think about it as compensation. I just changed it. Like, let's say I have a beautiful snare drum. Well, that night I might be playing a lot more snare drum than everything else. I'm certainly not going to play the same way I play if I had my drums or the drums from the night before. I'm going to completely change how I'm going to approach the music through the instrument that I have, that it's presented to me.
I'm curious. I mean, some of it too. I mean, as I'm asking the question, what your answer makes total sense to me. And I think I would have rephrased the question to be like, in my experience, like I had a really bad experience. We showed up to gig, we backlined a marimba, and they provided an instrument I'm not going to name it. No. It wasn't a clarinet. It was a marimba, and I'm not going to name any companies, but it was a very dry marimba to begin with. But the resonator caps were off because it was a practice instrument at a high school, so it was just like hitting a tabletop, and we were playing mallet quartet, and so like as you were saying your answer, it's like that's absolutely works. But I couldn't in that moment. Well, I can't say we couldn't. We didn't make the decision to play mallet quartet incredibly softly because my instrument just had no volume. I had to play way louder and heavier just to even make it resemble the sound everybody else was bringing, and that Steve Reich wants in his music. So there is I'm not saying that you can't do both in both worlds, but the improvisational world, it's a slightly easier fish to fry.
No, that is very different situation. You're playing music that's written by a composer who expects it to sound a certain way. That's completely different. Exactly. I should have prefaced that. Of course, in my world, there's lots of wiggle room, right? And like, if you're in that situation, that's tough, because then, sure, if in a different world, you could have just said, let's just play this whole piece, but at triple pianissimo, it'll just be different, right? But the composer would be like freaking out, right? So that's very interesting.
For you, what's the most important thing what's the most important thing you think you've learned that has come out of the singular experience of just being on the road and gigging? For me, it's been like, actually rhythm and time, like having good time and a good sense, like that's kind of, if that doesn't happen, nothing else matters. And being on the road, being in different halls, playing on different instruments, playing with different people, to me, it's like, oh wow, okay, I always got to come back to that no matter what. And that was something that I specifically learned by being on the road and being in the room with various musicians that I had to perform with at the drop of a hat, like you. I'm curious, for you, what did you learn being on the road that you didn't learn in school?
Well, there's millions of things that are, like funny and practical, like about hotels. But you're talking about music. So what I learned, basically, the most important thing, I think, was that I have to come to every situation naked. I cannot bring every night, I cannot bring any of the last night or the next night or last year with me, ever. No clothes that I've worn already. I have to come with like okay, and now I'm in a different hall with a different audience. Let's not forget the audience. A different vibe from the audience, from the people, and a different instrument, maybe different musicians I'm playing with, maybe not, but certainly they feel differently. It was a different train ride. Maybe I was upset that day. Right, all kinds
Maybe
of
the
things.
Soviet Union was falling.
Yeah, maybe the Soviet Union was
I just wanted to prompt you again there. I want to get to that at some point.
And so, I learned that I must shed all those things and start fresh every night and really, really use these. Really listen to what's going on. What is actually happening in this hall at this moment? What is actually happening? How am I going to tune my drums for the music, for the acoustics, for my mood, for what the drums want, there's 1,000 different things. So that's what I learned. No two nights are the same at all.
I think that's amazing. I mean, it's always interesting to hear you talk about the stuff that you like in your energy. I feel like that's one thing about you that if I were to sort of, at your funeral when I stand up to talk about you, Bobby, I don't want to, just so you know, the words amazing drummer are not going to be the first things out of my mouth. It's going to be like, you have no idea what it was like to stand next to that jet engine that only shoots out flowers. Like you have, like, it's like, that's what I'm going to say. Like you have this insatiable like drive, that applies to everything, not just drumming. And I think I kind of am jealous that I didn't get to be on the road with you, like during the like pre-internet days and just grinding it out. I think it would have, iron sharpens iron. So, well, hey, I want to ask you before I want to end with the Soviet Union story, but I want to ask you real quick. You're a composer too, and we mentioned terminals a few times along the way. I want to just ask you, you are somehow able to get away with things. Like Caroline Shaw gets away with writing triads that very few people can get away with. You get away with writing for whip crack and spoons. And you get away with it, and it makes total sense. And I have not been able to figure out how, and the only thing I keep coming back to is what I just said. You commit to it. And I'm curious if for you, like, is there anything you've committed to that just didn't work? Because so far, I've been asked to do some of the most insane shit by you, and somehow it always works. I scream "Hee-yah" and crack a whip like 5 or 6 times.
and do it well.
And it makes sense. That's the thing that's so goddamn confusing about you, Bobby. So how do you do that?
Yeah, but it's absolutely what you've just said. I mean, if you don't show total commitment all the time, then people know that. People pick up on that. Mm-hmm. And from the musician that you're asking to do something with, and to the audience, So you have to believe in it. Like you said, you have to. It's a 100%. You're just giving blood all the time. Why? Why not? Why give 95%? Why coast? Give it all, man. Just like, you're not going to hear that long. Just give the whole enchilada all the time.
Knowing your Italian upbringing, I remember the very first whip crack lesson I got from you. It might have, you were like, here's how you crack a whip, go practice it. And then you were like, now here's how you hiya. I want you to think of a spaghetti Western. And and I was like, what does that even mean? I don't even know what that means. I have spaghetti, I've seen Westerns, and you did this hiya, and I just remember going looking around the room trying to figure out where it came from. I was like, oh, okay, all right, fair enough. It's
that's what he means. Yeah. I still, that's from Ennio Morricone. From all those, all the great Western soundtracks, the spaghetti Westerns.
Right. Well, I think too. I think your experience with John Cage. A lot of in the wrong hands, approaching instruments, like a conch shell or a whip crack, it can be seen as kitschy because I think a lot of people do treat it as kitsch. But John Cage treated the conch shell like someone else might treat the violin. It's a sound. It works or it doesn't. And
you have to set it up, but that whip crack I think is well set up. You've got this all this stuff goes on, and then you sort of well, what could possibly be next? I know. A guy walking out, yelling don't forget the maracas, by the way.
Like a rattlesnake.
For the rattlesnake steak, and a whip in the right hand, and whipping and screaming. Well, of course, that makes perfect sense, right? But you have to sort of, right, exactly. It has to feel inevitable, Mm-hmm. Of course, this is what should happen. Yeah, you don't know what it is before as a listener, but then when you see it, you should say, "Oh my, that's right."
It's so fun to see the production managers at where'd we premiere it? It wasn't Miller Theater. Merkin.
Miller Theater. The ICA
Merkin, yeah. And as soon they had, because they were doing New Sounds live, right? It was being streamed live or something, and they had all those mics strung up and hanging 6 feet above our heads. And I've got this whip crack, right? And I don't, I'm good enough at it, but I'm not a marksman. I could have brought that whole thing crashing down, on the fourth movement before Medeski even comes out. And I could just see all the production managers running to update their liability insurance, whatever. There's some part
Neumann's,
but then some audience goer has their eye taken out because new music.
Yeah, well, it should be dangerous, right? That's what Lucas wants.
Well, I want to. I think these two things are related too. You said something at Soci that, and it was very close to your talk about your Russia story or your Soviet Union story. You talked about being a musician as being a stockbroker or a fireman, and you sort of talked about those two approaches as one being the planner, a good stockbroker. Let's just be clear: a good stockbroker is someone who plans for the long haul. You don't short your stocks because short-term gains are not they're not a healthy approach to life or music making. Firemen, on the other hand, it's not a sustainable approach to plan for the long term when you walk in a building and stick to that, because you walk up to a doorknob and if it's red hot, just because you plan to go through that door, it's not wise to go through it. So you've got to make a different decision. And I'm curious the kind of decisions you can make, right? I'm curious for you. Can you talk about that for 2 seconds and then somehow tell the story of the Soviet Union?
I have to save the Soviet Union for the next podcast.
No, Bobby, we gotta. I'm obsessed with that story, and I want to hear it. It was all about they did this study about where they took
firefighters and stockbrokers, and they had two contests. Doing stocks, selling and buying stocks, and both of them. So the firefighters would have to go up against the stockbrokers in stock fighting, buying, and then the stockbrokers would go up against the firefighters in firefighting, right? And so what happened was of course, the stockbrokers were better at selling stocks, but not by that much. But the firemen were way better with fighting a fire. And that's because of the way they make decisions. A firefighter doesn't wait. This is the essential thing. And this is what's essential about improvisation. The firefighter doesn't wait for the best possible decision to come. You can't wait. So what a firefighter does is looks around, assesses the situation, and makes the best decision at that moment he could make.
And I would say that's true not just for improvisation, but in a bigger picture, just live music. Like playing live is a different thing than rehearsing.
Yes, very much. And but then you make another decision. So you get to that point, you step on that piece of wood, and then you search the landscape again. And then you make another, and that's how you go through. You don't wait for the perfect decision. And as I like to, oftentimes I say in my improvisation workshops, which, I give an improvisation workshop now every year in the summer. This year it's online, of course. When you're starting to play a piece of music, and I think even an improvised piece of music and even a not improvised piece of music, always endeavor to see the end from the beginning. So what you're always trying to do is, as you start, to try to see the end, to hear the end, and almost kind of play backwards, So, but the end is always moving. It's a moving goalpost, right? So, just depending on what you do. So then you do this, and then you have to scan again. You scan the landscape again. Now where is the end? Now what's the arc of the piece? Now where's the end? And this way, you're playing, you're improvising, and your playing in general has a lot more structural integrity, because it's not just this, what's ever right in front of you. You're having a bigger picture, and you have dimensionality again.
Right. You're making a conscious choice to depart from your goal. Rather than in a live music setting, that decision isn't always conscious. Sometimes you have to, like choosing to break a rule is different than having to break a rule. And the goal has to always shift, right?
Because you don't know what the end. You don't know what it's going to be like at the end, right? You're just speculating. It's important to speculate. It's important to sort of feel the end. So it's not just a succession of these moments, that it's, that you are somehow putting that together into one whole,
Yeah. Well, I think that approach, that's something that has lodged in my, that's a thing that's stuck in my craw in chats, in just hearing you talk. And I appreciate that sentiment. It's something I've said in lessons. I've said it in coachings many, many times. I don't know if your ears were burning when I said it, but I try to cite you when I use it, just to be clear. I don't want to make money off of your ideas, but but I'm curious, just to sort of now I want to have my dessert here in my conversation with you. You told a story about how I feel like, you are on the road and you got stuck behind the Iron Curtain during the fall of the Soviet Union, and your firefighter analogy here strikes me as very, like, you had an end goal in mind, which was to get to a gig. Is that right?
Well, I had to get to Sardinia. I had a gig with Tim Byrne, and I had been in Moscow 9 days, and a coup hit, and they were freaking out. I was doing music for the Moscow Circus, which eventually went to Broadway, and I was rehearsing the band, and everything was groovy, and I had my hotel, Rosha, which had 89 billion floors. Every other floor had a bar, and every day I would have a champagne, and every morning I would have a champagne and caviar breakfast with my interpreter. I think it was $1.50. And then she would come and we would have a nice breakfast, and then we would drive and one day we came and we saw tanks around the Kremlin, because this hotel overlooked the Kremlin. And I said, is that normal? She said, no. And it was the coup of Gorbachev. So long story short, 2 nights later when I had to leave, uh, right before I left, they imposed a curfew. So we weren't supposed to be on the street, but I had to get to the airport, so I had to be on the street. So what followed was a whole evening all through the night of us drinking champagne and her trying to get me a ride to the airport. She got me like 5 or 6 rides to the airport, and then they would call back and go, no, I'm too scared. No, I'm drunk. He's drunk. No, the KGB won't let me. I don't know, all this stuff. Like, you have a ride. And I said, great, let's have another drink. And then, no, you don't have a ride. And I was like, oh, no, got to give me a ride. So finally she got me a ride, some brave soul who was going to drive me. And guy showed up, this little, Skoda taxi cab. And I said to her, from the back seat, I said, I've got Finnmarks, Deutschmarks, dollars, everything he needs. Just get me to the airport. Whatever he wants, I've got, hard currency, no problem. So, we're driving. It's quite far to the airport from Moscow.
How old are you now at this point?
Oh, I was 40, maybe 39, 40.
Okay.
Maybe I was something like that. And we get to this checkpoint with this, the little Skoda putters up to this gigantic modern tank. Like a modern tank is really big, Josh. How you see those tanks on the village green, like those little World War I? No, modern tank is enormous, and this little thing, and there's something burning, a car burning in the background, and the guy gets out and they wouldn't let us through. And I was like, he's going to take you back to the hotel. I said, no, you got to, let us through. And so you got to argue with him, give him more money. So he took all these back roads and got to another checkpoint, and they let us through. But, that's the Reader's Digest version. But, right before they let us through, they came up to the car with the machine guns, and they were just right up against my window, and, both sides. And she looked at me and she said, she was a little like Natasha from Bullwinkle. You remember Bullwinkle? Mm-hmm. She called me darling. She was just like Natasha. And she was tall, too. It was just the same thing. And she looked at me and said, so, darling, are you nervous? And I was actually kind of drunk by that time and, kind of like digging it like, wow, this is Bobby Predator from Niagara Falls. And now I'm in like, I'm going to the airport and there's a machine gun like next to me. And this is actually kind of cool. I know it's weird and I should be worried. But
your poor dad is just rolling over in his grave like, what did I do wrong?
And she said to me, she looked me right in the face and she said, good, darling. Do not be nervous, but do not move and do not say anything. And so I'm like, okay, and so finally I got out. The airport was like a little city. We were stepping over people. She bribed to get me to the front of the line. Everything was, we bribed, no problem. Bribed, and I got to the front line and I got to my gig. I had no drumsticks and I had to borrow Elvin Jones's mallets and Max Roach's brushes and drumsticks to play my gig.
That's
that
amazing.
Was something.
I've been to Russia twice.
In Elvin Jones's mallets, I can't even, I picked them up and it was just like, what? They want to do what? Yeah, it was so unbelievable.
I've been to Russia twice, and we had this is post-Soviet, the fall of the Soviet Union. It was much safer, but we had translators too. And the thing about that was that was my first cultural shock. I mean, it was I think 2007, my first time out of the country really, other than being in Trinidad. But it's in Russian. Russian is not related to any other language. Like if you speak Italian, you can go to Spain and be like, you can get by. Like there's enough of overlap, but you're in Russia. So our translator gets out and she's taking us to the airport, right? And she gets out and some guard comes up and they're screaming at each other. Screaming. Gesticulating wildly, and her face is beet red and they're yelling. And we're like, oh my God, we're never going to get out of here. And she comes back and we're like, what's the matter? And she's like, oh, he was just saying there's no more half and half at the deli. So if you want half and half, you have to go to the next terminal or something. It was like, Like, y'all need to, like, I know your history is really complicated, but let's take it down to like a 6. We're at like 11 all the time. Well, hey, Bobby, I am really grateful for your time. I'm grateful to have you as a friend, and I wish we could hang out more often, but I hope we can get together in the same room sooner than later.
Me too. Please tell all the boys, give them all my best. Will you?
I will do that.
All your crew. I love all of you guys, and thank you. It was really fun.
We'll give your best to Andrea and your side of the family over there, and we'll talk soon, my friend.
All right, man. Goodbye, bye.
All right, see you, buddy. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that conversation. This podcast was brought to you by Liquid Drum, liquiddrum.com, liquidrum.com, run by Todd Meehan down there in Waco, Texas. Good content, awesome merch, funny. You won't regret it. Check him out, liquiddrum.com. And also, DunleavySteelPans.com. Kyle Dunleavy makes amazing steel pans. Check him out, DUNLEAVY pans.com. Okay, I will talk to you soon. Please be nice to each other. Take care, be safe, and stay healthy. Take it easy.